Oakland, California, also hard hit as individuals there set fire to the Alameda County Courthouse late Saturday night. Mayor Libby Schaaf warning that the unrest could justify the deployment of federal agents to the city, which she has resisted. Joining us now, U.S. Customs and Border Protection Acting Commissioner Mark Morgan. Mark, good to see you. We could sit here and go through the list of cities that saw violence over the weekend, including New York City, unrest here. What do you, in terms of the federal government's role, to which cities do you see more federal agents being added, whether it's to protect federal property or if to assist, say, in a Chicago, the investigative part of what the police there are doing? So what are you seeing in terms of deployment of federal agents?
Well, David, that's a good question. And I think we need to separate two distinct things happening. One is the violence and anarchy against federal property. That's going to require one response. That's what you're seeing in Portland and in Seattle, versus the increased crime that's going on in Chicago and Kansas City and other states and cities. That's going to require special agents and other federal officers to work with state and locals specifically to address violent crime. But that's not what we're seeing in Portland. The secretary is spot on. We're going to go wherever the threat tells us we need to go. And keep in mind, it wasn't that long ago in Oakland, we had an FPS officer, Patrick Underwood, that was shot and killed and another one wounded. This is serious, and people need to separate peaceful protests from the criminal anarchy that's going on.
Well, that was one thing I wanted to bring up. You say FPS, that is the Federal Protective Service. It's one component of the Department of Homeland Security. And so for a lot of the pushback that you get from the left, and even some people, like many people, that according to the FPS's mission statement, Andy McCarthy writes about this on FoxNews.com last week, it includes the protection of U.S. government infrastructure, services, and the people who provide and receive them. This is in the authority of the Federal Protective Service. So anybody who tries to suggest that this is federal government overreach, this is the very duty of these divisions of government and these officers.
Dave, you're absolutely right, and I read that op-ed, and Andy, as always, he's spot on. Title 40 USC 1315 doesn't ask the secretary, it directs the secretary to protect federal facilities. We have about 9,000 in the United States. We had credible actionable intelligence in Portland that they were going to attack the building. That's why we put additional resources there. And of course, what happened? They did just that. That's an important distinction that American people need to understand. We have a statutory responsibility to be there, and that's what we're doing.
Andy was speaking in part directly as Andy McCarthy to Tom Ridge, the first Homeland Security Secretary, who referred to the president's personal militia, having to explain to him the way government actually works and the powers that these agents and these divisions of the government have. So we won't go there. But I want to get this. So gun violence in Chicago, there are an additional, 200 agents that are being sent or have been sent to Chicago to help rein in the out-of-control violence. Those individuals sent there because violence is worsening. But Mayor Lori Lightfoot said over the weekend that the city is, quote, inundated with guns from outside of Illinois, citing a 2017 gun trace report that 60% of the city's illegal guns come from across state lines. Lightfoot says President Trump should enact gun control if he wants to help that plagued city. I will just point out, she said that, here's her exact quote, "We are being inundated with guns from states that have virtually no gun control, no background checks, no ban on assault weapons. That is hurting cities like Chicago." But what about the places that those guns are allegedly coming from? Why isn't there, like, runaway violence and murder in those streets? Why?
Dig, that's a good question. Look, I'm not going to be pulled in to her political narrative. But what I can tell you, this is exactly what the president's doing. He's sending in additional resources to augment the federal folks that are already there, working with city, state, and local law enforcement every single day to try to address the increase in violence. This is exactly what we should be doing. We should be talking about coming together, sharing information, working together in law enforcement, not defund law enforcement. That's one of the absolute travesties of the narrative that's going on right now.
It's what you hear from people who are out protesting in Chicago, somehow that defunding the police is going to make murder go away in that city. One thing, and also about the federal law enforcement agents working with the state and local authorities. It's worked before. It worked here in New York City when Rudy Giuliani was a federal prosecutor. They would have DEA agents working with the state police and the NYPD going into kind of hotbeds of activity like in Hell's Kitchen, because about 80% of gang crime is drug crime. Drug crime is a federal crime, and you can actually have, or it's a racketeering enterprise, you can actually have the feds come in and charge these crimes, say charge murder in a federal court, and you wind up getting a longer sentence because of that. I want to move on to this, though. Law enforcement under attack. You were mentioning this. There are 59 police officers injured in Seattle over the weekend in clashes with protesters. I mean, these are anarchists. They're violent demonstrators, while law enforcement in Richmond, Virginia faced rocks and batteries from rioters. Over the weekend, you also highlighted on Twitter that in Portland, protesters threw metal spikes to target the vehicles of federal law enforcement agents deployed to quell the violence. How dangerous is this for people in law enforcement, Mark? And why do the Democrats seem to stand behind this disorder and violence?
You know, Dega, I don't understand it. All I can see after doing this for 30 years is they're absolutely putting politics over public safety, and specifically the safety of these brave men and women that are out there doing their statutory responsibility that we've asked them to do. But make no mistake, it is dangerous out there, and it has been every single night. And again, we need to make a distinction from the peaceful protesters to these criminals and anarchists that take over the protest every single night. They are organizing, planning with the willful intent to destroy federal property and harm federal officers, and they're bringing weapons every single night with that intent. It's absolutely disgusting. We should be united to stop this instead of encouraging them.
Mark, before we go, are there any other cities where you expect that federal agents will be deployed in one of two ways, either to protect federal property, as you're seeing in Portland, but also to work in coordination with state and local law enforcement in an investigative role?
Look, that's a great question, and we are continuing to work with our state and local partners. We have not seen the resistance anywhere else like we have in Portland, and I don't want to get too far ahead of our operational requirements, but I can guarantee you if we have actionable intelligence that federal property is going to be targeted, we will be there to help the Federal Protective Service do their job.
Mark, great to see you. Thank you so much for being here. Mark Morgan.